Well, as I said at the beginning of this evening, this night is our sort of people night. And if you remember from my introduction yesterday, I said, most companies fail because of people issues more than technology or anything else. So the beginning of tonight, we talked about negotiation, which people do. But beyond that, it's, how do you get people to join your venture? How do you organize your venture? How do you plan for growth? What happens if things aren't going quite right? And that's where having people that know a lot about how organizations work and how to deal with that become very important. So tonight, we have a panel to discuss those issues. I asked Vivian Vitale here, who's on the board with me at NetScout Systems, if she would organize a panel on this discussion point. When I was talking to Vivian about joining the NetScout board, I realized that it's a very small world out there. Vivian had been a people person, so to speak, for a lot of founder-led companies. It turned out a number of them I actually was involved in some way or another, so we had never met. But it is a small world. And by the way, that's an important thing to remember in your careers going forward. You never know how small the world's going to be. People that are in this course you'll run into, people that have been in this before you'll run into. And it's always important to act with integrity. There's a story I had of one entrepreneur that really got upset with his co-founder and booted him out of the company and was just terrible to him. Well, it turns out the next venture that guy did, the venture firm that invested put on his board the person who had been his co-founder. And if you think that wasn't hell and payback, he said, I wish I'd been a better person. So with that, I'll turn you to a panel of very great people. Vivian, you want to take it away?
Good evening, everybody, and I'm really happy to be here. I hope that we will have an interactive discussion. We have material prepared here and questions in the event you guys get stuck and don't have a lot of questions for us. My colleagues here, I'll let them introduce themselves, but we've worked together before, and we got to know each other very well through our working history together. And though we have very different working experiences, even though we have that one core one that we experienced together. And my background has been in human resources. It's been called different things now. Typically, the top person in the job is, as Allison's title is, Chief People Officer. And years ago, it used to be called Personnel Management, and then it became Human Resource Management. But as Joe mentioned, in all of our work and all of our lives, right, our interactions with others, who we connect with, who we share values with, who we share our work ethic with, those are the people that we enjoy being with, not only personally as well as professionally. My early career, I had the opportunity to work in a company that was probably around 5,000 people when I joined, and I got to see it go to 15,000 people. And then I saw it go down to 2,500 people in a period of like 10 years. And so in that job, I got more of a foundational kind of experience. But I'll tell you more about the things that I think are important, particularly in founder-led companies, but the things that I think are important in any company, regardless of size or scale. And I think I'll let Allison and Kim tell you a little bit about their perspective. I think what I'll bring to the table is maybe my experience has been more with really early stages and some founders, and then I have seen those scale. They have different experiences, but equally important, and I think you can learn as much from their experiences, even if you're in an early stage or as a founder, because of what they've seen through what they've experienced. And so I'll turn it over to Allison now to tell you a little bit about herself, and then we'll get into a little bit of the meat and start to take some of your questions a little later. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Allison Bayiates. Very nice to be here with you all this evening. I am Chief People Officer at Veracode. We used to be called Human Resources, and we rebranded to People We're actually called People Success because I wanted to convey, how we see ourselves. We're there to help people be successful. And human resources has become a little bit antiquated at this point. It is becoming more about, having the right people in the right jobs. So that's why we did the rebrand. I've been at Veracode for just under 7 years, which is hard to believe. It's been a different place every year, a different set of challenges. I have about 30 years in human resources, all told, and yeah, it's been a great experience. So look forward to talking to you about that in a bit. But Kim, I'll let you introduce yourself.
So, good evening. My name is Kim Crowley. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I'm Vice President of Human Resources at Thermo Fisher Scientific. So, like these two ladies, I've had about 25 years worth of experience in human resources, predominantly at Thermo Fisher. I've spent, joined there 2009, we're about $9 billion in revenue. Today, Thermo Fisher's at $45 billion in revenue and 125,000 people. So, very different experience, but along the way, really kind of watched how the company has been able to scale their business through process and people, and looking forward to the conversation tonight. Thanks.
Thank you both. The thing that I would say is I was thinking about when Joe asked me to participate here, in any organization, but particularly in the early stages, what was most important. After I actually was at Veracode, before Allison was in that role, she and I worked together for a while there. And then I was so pleased that she succeeded me in the top people job there. But after I left there, it was about 6 years ago, I did my own consulting practice. And in that consulting practice, I mostly helped very early stage companies. And in one situation, I helped an early stage company that had two co-founders, co-CEOs. And I think what was most important in each of those situations, I mean, certainly you have to have a viable product, a viable idea, and you have to have hopefully some market potential for what you're doing. But once you start to build out, what you need and what you want, I think it's very important for the founder and any people that he or she is working with, that you have a alignment around really your vision for the organization. And I'm sure, in your courses around entrepreneurship, you've had discussions around, your vision and your mission and your values of your organization. And I can't really emphasize enough how important those are. And having clarity around that and agreement. And if you are the founder and you're just getting going and you're going to add people to your organization, having clarity about what you're trying to achieve and what you need to complement you. The other thing that I think that people talk about but don't really operate always with is a real understanding of what they value. I think often in technology companies, people value, certainly the technical expertise, and that's very, very important, particularly with the types of products typically that technology companies or biotechnology companies have. But I don't think that people often talk about how they want to operate and what's important to them for how people are treated, for example. In the best organizations I've been a part of, that I've worked in, and those companies where I've consulted, I would say that the best ones had really high standards of excellence and high standards of performance, for sure. But the best ones also had compassion for others, either how that translated itself. It may have been respect for others and respect for people's work. I think you can have a high achieving culture and still have a culture of kindness and one that brings out the best in others. And I love that Veracode has rebranded as People Success because, really we're all here to do the best that we can. I mean, I have also worked longer than these guys, so I won't tell you how old I am and how long I've worked, but I would say that generationally things have changed and how we communicate and how we like to get information now, what's available to us has certainly changed in my lifetime. But what hasn't changed in my lifetime is that everybody needs and wants meaningful work. And they want to feel that they're making a difference in terms of what they're doing. And people want to be recognized for that. So as a leader and as a founder, if you can help create that around what you're trying to do, you can inspire people to come and work with you and work around you. Um, I think as an extension of that, even in the very early stages, to document some of those things in a way that there is clarity around them, but also to talk about them as, almost a set of operating principles. So when you know what you're trying to do as an organization, to try to codify sort of how decisions will be made or how you will come together, how you will communicate and all that. And it doesn't have to be extensive, but I do think the rules of the road in terms of the environment and the culture that you're trying to create early on is really important. And if you are a founder and a leader, you have an enormous responsibility as you're bringing others into the organization to not only share your vision, but also share in making you successful. And I think what's important is understanding that there's a reciprocity that happens there. You know, you're there, they're the people that you hire there to help make you and the organization successful, but you also have that responsibility to return that to them. I think from once you start to do that and you start to think about how you want to operate, then it sort of comes out in your behaviors in your organization. And you may be a company of 2 people to start. But as you grow and you add people to the organization, trying to have clarity also in terms of where roles and responsibilities come together is also very important. I think what I've seen happen in early stage companies very much is that, often you're bootstrapped and you don't have, cash to hire people and whatever, then hopefully you get some money that comes in either through your sales or through investors. And it's often hard to start to parse out what the work is. That, one person was kind of doing everything. And then maybe that person, has an expertise in marketing, for example, and maybe that's the best use of that person, but maybe that person was also doing some service work or what have you. Really trying to have clarity and breaking down roles and responsibilities. And if you're almost before you would bring in more people into the organization to try to have clarity about what that person would do. I think often people early days think they need somebody with, the backgrounds that we have. And frequently people look for someone to help them hire the right people for the job. And I think it is good to get some outside expertise on that if you can afford it. And if you can't afford it, you could ask for some help. There's certainly courses you could take. There's tons of things I'm sure you can research online, but taking that time in preparing in terms of really thinking what you need and then taking that time as you bring someone to the organization is also really critically important. I also think that structure, having some sort of structure early on is important. Again, not only with roles and responsibilities, but how things are done. I don't think that you need to have a lot of bureaucracy, certainly, but I think to have certain processes that you put in place for how things are established, a lot of times that gets skipped. And people are just focused in on being very reactive to doing the work that needs to be done. And it's always more than you really probably can handle at one time. As you, get some success and you end up having, more critical mass, I would say, in my experience, it's been when you have anywhere between 25 and 50 people in your early stage company, that's about when you might need some outside expertise. It's not that you would necessarily have to hire somebody with a background in people management or whatever, but if you could get, someone to help coach you a little bit, or if you could get someone who would be willing, to serve as just a resource to you, I would really encourage you to do that. And I would say that those things that are important in the early stages of a company are the things also that as the companies scale, you need. The smallest company I went in as head of people was probably around 55 people. And, there was a finance person was sort of in there first, and a lot of the things that would have fallen under then my responsibility had sort of been started to be in place. But, I brought a different point of view in terms of trying to put policies and procedures in place, as well as whatever benefits we would provide to people or how we would pay them in a way that was different than just purely looking at it from a financial point of view. Was also really important to me that I partnered with the senior leadership in terms of, not only what their vision was, but again, back to how they wanted to operate and what kind of environment they wanted to create to attract people. But also, for me, I always wanted to create the type of environment that I wanted to work in. And that was my motivation for, continuing to have, a role in human resources. And in the best situation that I worked in, which was with these two folks, we built that organization from about 55 people to about 1,800, and we were global. And, we had a culture that no matter where you went, if you went to, it was a company called RSA Security. If you went to RSA in Japan or Ireland or Australia or Vancouver or, San Francisco, the culture of the company was the same, even though they were different culturally in those different ethnicities, because the leadership of the company had a set of values and a way of operating that again had high standards, but also looked to develop people, take prudent risk on people, and make sure that people were having their needs met as well. So a little bit of an overview from sort of my pearls of wisdom for some of the things that I've seen with the companies I've worked with. And I'm going to ask Allison and Kim to share some of their perspectives, and then we'd love to just have the rest of the time be interactive and have you ask any questions that some of our comments might have spurred for you.
Well, Viv, one of the things that really resonates with me is, how you talked about being intentional about values and mission and purpose. When I started with Veracode, we were venture-backed, and 2 months after I started, it was announced we were going to be acquired by CA Technologies. And so we were acquired by a public company and part of a public company for 2 years. And then when they were acquired, we were acquired by private equity. So we've now had 2 private equity owners, and that has been a different set of challenges, entirely. So, becoming part of a public company, you kind of break things down a little bit. Some areas are functionally integrated, and some, are left kind of as a business unit. And so coming out of that experience, because you no longer have a leadership team, being part of private equity, our challenge was we had to build everything from the ground up. So we had to hire a new leadership team. We had to hire, positions that we hadn't hired before, key roles and responsibilities that we needed to be successful in private equity that weren't as important in a private company or a venture-backed company. So having that kind of solid foundation of, understanding what the core values are through all of that change and through all of people coming and going, because a lot of people left during that time, those 4, 5 years, and a lot of new people came, but the culture stayed the same because the executive team was very aligned on what the values are and what our mission and our purpose was. So I couldn't agree more that those things are important to really take time to think through, align on, and make sure that you're hiring to those values. What tends to happen in a company our size, we're under 500 million. We are about 650 people. And it's a very, very fast-paced environment. So what tends to happen is there's a real desire to fill any gaps that you have. And sometimes the desire is to move really quickly to do that, when it's much, much more prudent to take the time to document, as your previous presenter was talking about, what are the interests of all the different stakeholders? Really document what you need, and then think through what are the characteristics of that person as you hire them. Do they fit within that core values? Are they aligned to the mission and purpose? Because hiring mistakes at that level are very, very expensive and hard to work out. You lose a lot of time, and it takes quite a bit So, while I love that fast-paced environment and I'm energized by the different set of challenges that present themselves every day, every year, I think sometimes you need to slow down to speed up. And so that's kind of what I take away from this environment.
Thank you.
So, just something that I would echo both Viv and Allison's sentiment around culture and values. I think that's probably one of the most important things that you can do. Even in a company the size of Thermo Fisher Scientific, we have our 4I values and we live by them. So no matter where you are in Thermo, there's always kind of a micro culture depending upon where you came in or what company was acquired. But what is consistent and true is, our values. And one of the most significant that our CEO will echo is integrity and leading with integrity. It's just kind of table stakes. It's how we're supposed to come in and act. Flipping that, another example that I'll give, and I didn't really share this experience, but when I started with Thermo Fisher, I left after about 11 years with the company, and I was the head of HR for a small company that we took public. And it was a company that was part of a larger organization. They had bought a whole bunch of little life science companies and there wasn't ever really any integration with the organization. So as we went public, one of the things that we really needed was to create a culture. And, the employee population really wanted to understand what is our mission? What's our purpose here? And so really looking, one, including them in the process of, okay, so what are our values going to be and what's your voice in that and how do you contribute to it? And the second part of that was really kind of looking at our product portfolio and tying that back to the patient. And so that's something that really draws employees in is even though I'm making a plastic pipette, which isn't the sexiest product, it's helping a patient in X, Y, and Z. And the patient becomes you, your mother, your sister, your brother, your child. So drawing them in on the product you're offering and the value that they're bringing is something that you win the hearts and minds of your employees. So I think that's really important. Being in a very large company and watching it grow over the years, the idea of scalability and being able as a leader to stand back and say, where's the company going and how can I anticipate that? And I'm telling you right now, you're never going to get that 100% right. So allowing yourself a little bit of flexibility to say, if I'm wrong over the next couple of years, I pivot, whatever that might mean, whether it's structurally, whether it's some process, whether it's some investment that you've made from a system standpoint, it's always going to happen. It's just how do you pivot and how do you recover from it? But looking long-term at, how do you scale, looking at your investment profile, how do you want to make your investment? And what is that going to mean for a return and your ability to scale, whether that be from supply chain standpoint, whether it's, financial standpoint, and then more importantly, your people, which is something that, in my job and the businesses that I have, we have struggled with significantly over the years, just in terms of, do we have the right general management talent? So when we look at how much the company is going to grow or how much we're going to grow through acquisition, do we have the right general management talent to put in place? Has been a struggle. COVID years have been crazy. So you've got the highs and the lows and really my team I have very large manufacturing facilities where I am today. So really being able to work very closely with the supply chain, understand what the signal is, the demand signal, working with operations, and then how do you build your talent into that to make sure that you're able to actually deliver on revenue. So scalability is going to be important, but make no mistake that that's going to change as your company continues to grow. You pivot and you figure out what's different about what you thought about maybe 4 to 5 years ago, and how do you pivot and move forward from there.
Thank you. So, I think that you'll see that there were threads, that were similar no matter, what size an organization may be. And kind of back to what I had said earlier, I really do believe that, focusing on the good of the whole and making sure that an organization gives back to its employees as well as, taking their skills and knowledge that they bring to the table. It's really a partnership in the best of situations. And certainly it doesn't always work out that way. And certainly there's times where you have to make changes. I think in the earlier stage companies, often a lot of times, it's hard to tell when you have people that are good at certain stages of organizations too, and the right leader early on may not be the right leader, to help an organization scale, for example, and knowing when to make it, and the CEO that founded the company may not be the right person to lead it forward. It takes a lot of humility to be able to see that yourself, and often the leaders can't see that, but that happens. In the company that we worked at together, the person that founded it is still there. And he's the evangelist. He was, Veracode does application security testing. And he was one of the original hackers for good, worked with Richard Clark on, I forget which president regime that was. But he had the foresight to know that he didn't want to run the company. He wanted to make the world, safe through, online safety and security and all that. He wanted that, but he thought he could do better by being an evangelist than running that organization. So early days, there was always someone else, running that organization. And I thought, what a self-aware person to be able to see that and to know that. And he's still with it and makes a wonderful contribution and does such good in terms of his education of providing his knowledge to so many people. So we talked a lot, and hopefully we set the table, and we'd love to hear any questions that you have on any subject related to the management of people in an early stage, in places that you've worked before, and things that you think have changed. And we'll hopefully fill the rest of our time with all of that. And if you run out of questions, I have ones we can ask ourselves and contribute hopefully to your knowledge.
Perfect. Any, which side? Oh, was you raising a hand?
Thank you. What are the most common mistakes founders make when they're hiring the early team, when they're just starting out?
Did you guys get that?
What are the most common mistakes that founders make when they're hiring? So I would say, in my experience, what I spoke about a little bit and maybe wasn't as clear as I could have been, really understanding what you're hiring, what you're really looking for. What are the skills that you're really looking for? What problem are you trying to solve in your organization? Where do you need a complement of a skill? What exactly, having real clarity. A lot of times there's not real clarity in what you're looking for. And then I think a lot of times in interviewing, particularly if we're doing it for the first time, we tend to talk more than we listen. And in order to really understand, what that candidate is going to bring to you, you really need to, ask open-ended questions, but really listen. And the best thing I think to do is to really ask for examples of where they've done things, to do, sort of called a behavioral interview. So they will tell you more about what they did and, bring samples of their work. I know my daughter just went through a job search and every place she went had her do so much work as a part of her interviewing process. And that's not something that I had done before. I actually was a little turned off by some of it because I thought, these companies are getting all this free information from all these candidates coming through. But I do think there's something to be said for letting a person bring in an example of their work or speak to an example of their work so you can really understand that. So I would say that's the most important thing. And then I would say after you've brought someone in, you often know early on if you made a mistake or if you didn't. And if you made a mistake, it's better to handle that quickly, as opposed to generally the mistakes don't get better. They tend to get worse over time. And if you aren't seeing the behavior or the contribution in the way that you need to be open and honest and respectful in terms of how you would treat someone, but to go back and say, look at, I think, I may have made an error in my judgment in terms of bringing you in. This is maybe what I need. And you handled that in a nice way. But those were the things that I think, and people hesitate to do that, right? And so often that will linger longer than it should. So hopefully that helps. Thank you. Their question.
Good afternoon. Just out of curiosity, how long is this window, do you think? Because typically when somebody comes onto a team, there's that initial period where, you're going to fight a little, like your process might not be the same, but eventually there's a point where you decide this is the person or not. When have you seen that timeline be? A month, a year, a week?
You want to say that?
So if I understood the question, it's if you make a mishire, if you hire someone who's not working out, how long should you let that go on? We actually, I've had this situation come up several times, and I would say invest initially on great onboarding. I think really terrific onboarding, helping the person understand, the business in depth, helping the person understand their colleagues, who their stakeholders are, what the expectations of the role are, and then giving very redirective feedback if necessary. If you start to see the person going off in the wrong direction, redirect them, give them very clear feedback right away. Don't let any time go by before you give them feedback. And then, at the point that you start to get feedback from the team that, well, this isn't quite right, this doesn't feel right, there's something, we're not missing, we're not hitting deliverables. To me, that's within a 3 to 6 month period. Yep.
Kim, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, so I would agree with Allison and Viv. It's about a 3 to 6 month window usually. I think the other signals that you just need to watch for is when you know it's a mistake as well, and you're hearing from the rest of the team members. Oftentimes what I'll see managers do is they'll compensate for it because they don't want to deal with the issue, or they have, we're human beings. It's really hard to give very direct feedback. And you see it time and time again where I'll have managers that just they're not very truthful, or they don't want to give them the hard truth. That's really important in these relationships is making sure you're having honest conversations. But oftentimes when that doesn't happen and it's not dealt with, it festers within the team. So there's a cost to that as well that you just have to be cognizant of is, what is the cost to the rest of the organization and the team when you have one person who's not necessarily pulling their weight. And so oftentimes when you put it that way, it helps managers kind of get through some of those tougher conversations, able to deal with it.
Yep.
Yeah, you lose credibility as a leader if you don't deal with a mishire. If you have someone on staff that's not doing the things they need to do to contribute to the overall objectives of the company, you lose credibility as a leader. And to your point about feedback, I think it is a kindness to be very direct with people, to be kind and deliberate in a way that is not harsh, but to be very clear about where the person is not meeting expectations. Otherwise, if you dance around it or try to wrap it in a nice package, it sometimes just the person doesn't understand it.
Yeah. And very often, it's really a mismatch of skills. I mean, everybody, most people come in and they want to try to do a good job, right? And a lot of times it's hard to assess what the skills are. I mean, in the best situation I had was a company that was, when we were growing a lot, we brought in a lot of inside salespeople. And those are people you typically would come in who had had some sort of selling experience, but mostly college degree and wanted to have a career in sales. But a lot of times they couldn't handle rejection. They didn't know how to close. They were good people. They thought they wanted to be salespeople, but that really wasn't their skill set. That just wasn't how they were wired. But what we found was once they learned the product, we had a customer success function. And, it had that customer interface, the pace that they were looking for, but it was, their role was more problem solving with the customer. So often when people didn't succeed in that selling role, we were able to try them in another function. And, I think if someone has a good work ethic, they are a cultural fit for your company. I do think taking prudent risk on people that maybe aren't succeeding in one organization, if it's skills related, or you maybe seeing if there is a place in the other in the organization, if you have that luxury where you're growing and you're hiring, you might be able to have some transfer in. And if you can see that, and that's a very good way sometimes to solve a problem. But I agree fully. I think if there's any mistake I've seen every leader make, from CEO to, first line manager, it's always waiting too long and thinking that you're doing the kinder, gentler thing by not telling them that they're failing. But, no one wants to fail, and no one really, wants that information withheld from them. The kinder, gentler thing is always to be honest and deliver it with respect for the person and kindness. But people procrastinate, on that. And then often leaders fail for lacking to take that kind of initiative.
Vivian, can I do a follow-up question with that?
Sure.
You had a situation where somebody tried inside sales and it wasn't working, and you moved them to customer support or success. Are there tools that people use to try to figure out whether a candidate is going to fit with a job?
Well, that's a-
Attributes of their personality, skill sets,
You
is
know,
anything like
yeah,
that?
I think that's
And what do you
right.
think about those?
Yeah, I think that there's no tools that I found, but in that customer success job, for example, we had trouble filling it. Because we didn't really look at what the skills were. We were looking actually for people who had that experience, someone who had done customer success in a software as a service company, in ideally a security company is what we were looking for at the time. Well, if you broke it down and said, well, really what was important here, the skill that was really required there was really good problem solving skills. Okay, that was really the key. And so we kind of changed what we were looking for. And we, when I went to hire people, I looked for people, even if they were, again, just a few years of experience, but what kind of jobs did they have? There's this one woman that worked, I forget, in some crazy store situation where she was kind of like the help desk on anything that went wrong. And she ended up being like one of the best customer success representatives. And we ended up pairing up our less experienced people with people that had the more technical background, and we sort of had a senior and an associate, and then that was also a growing ground for us to do it. So I think that if you think about what is the skill that's needed, it also will help, I think, you broaden your recruitment base. If you think about the skills that are required, and certainly education and experience are important, but I think you also can bring in more diverse employee group if you're less focused on a particular profile, and more open to, what skills does this person bring through maybe different experience. I always think it's good to take prudent risk on people. And Allison left because we had a CEO who had, Kim probably remembers this too. He had a way of hiring, and it was, if people know the children's nursery rhyme of Old MacDonald Farm, it was Old MacDonald's farm. And Old MacDonald's farm, Old MacDonald had a farm, and on the farm they said E-I-E-I-O. So on the E-I-E-I-O, he would use for a hiring profile. And the first E was enthusiasm. And that was the most important, the enthusiasm, energy that people would bring to the table. And then the I was intelligence, but it wasn't necessarily always the degree that a person had, but it could be their emotional intelligence. It could be their street smarts. And so that would be the second most important thing. The third thing was experience, and that energy and enthusiasm and the intelligence would always trump the experience. It would be more important. And then the next I was integrity, and you never compromised on integrity. And then the last thing was organizational fit. And it's a little rubric, but it was one that I think is a good one, and it's easy to remember. And the only thing is I found that internationally, this always didn't translate very well. But everybody knew that on Old MacDonald's farm, the cow says moo, and it's E-I-E-I-O, but it's an American children's rhyme that hopefully that will be helpful to you.
There's just a quick follow-up on the Zoom on that about personality assessments. How do you, have you used things like the Myers-Briggs personality assessments in hiring or other personality assessments, and how do you feel they are best used and where they fit in to the hiring process?
Go to that.
Yeah, so different companies we've used, we've used Myers-Briggs or a DISC assessment. In some cases, when we're hiring executives, we'll use an outside consulting firm to do a really in-depth assessment. They typically, in my experience, they go one or two ways. Either it's helpful or it's not. I think you just have to be careful of the danger that you're getting a glimpse of how somebody responded in a specific period of time. And what happens is I've had some executives who read it and say, oh, that's really interesting. I think based on how they are responding, a lot of their responses really coincide with our core values. I've had other executives who simply say, oh, this is it. John loves innovation. That's it, done. We're going to hire him. And then we find out we're truly disappointed with what we've seen because we don't, we take it so literally and have an expectation. We've got a full glimpse of a human being on a piece of paper. So I think you just have to, if that's something that you do choose to do, you really have to take it with it's a piece of information that is going to inform your broader decision.
Yeah.
I would agree with Kim. I've used them for senior hires. I love predictive index, Myers-Briggs, DISC assessment. I think they're all very useful for things like team building, building awareness, but I'm not a fan of using them for hiring. My experience is most managers are not equipped to really translate, a personality assessment in a hiring situation. I would advise, there's a great book called Who that is written by, I think it's Jeffrey Smart. And it really helps boiling down, what are you looking for? I would put your energy much more into understanding documenting the profile of the person you want, building out the competencies of the person you want, thinking about who your interviewers are going to be and directing them on what you want them to interview for. The biggest problem around mishiring is that we meet people and we seek confirming evidence. We want that person to be the fit for the job, because hiring is no fun. It's no fun to have a gap that you have to fill. So your inclination is to try to get it filled as quickly as possible. And so people don't take the time up front to really build out and be intentional about what it is that they're looking for.
Yeah.
So I think I would put the energy around that as opposed to a personality assessment.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that those tools have value, very much so. We've used them a lot for team building and helping people understand difference. I worry also that any of those tests, in my experience, have built-in bias. And I just think that culturally, ethnically, gender, all of that is sort of biased by those tests. And so I never, again, as these folks, I have used them a little bit, but it's one piece. And over reliance on anything like that is, to me, not just doing the work in terms of taking the time, as Allison described, to really figure out the competencies and what have you. There's another book that Allison made me think of when she referenced the other one. One of my favorite ones is just a book really around competencies. It's called For Your Improvement, and it's by Lominger. And you can get it on Amazon and paperback. And I like having it as a book as opposed to online because it's a good reference material. And if you have people that you end up employing, it gives you a good way to coach around things that you want to reinforce, as well as things that you maybe want to help improve. the other thing that book has that better than any place I had ever read, it was a whole section on career stallers and stoppers. And in my experience, it reflected exactly the things that I saw that caused people to fail, particularly in leadership. Failure to hire the right people, failure to develop the right people, arrogance, not being other-centered. All those things are the things that I think would cause people to fail. And that book does a really good job, and it's worth the investment. Used to be about $85. I don't know what it is now,
So
but
it's about 100 now.
okay, inflation like anything else, right?
Two questions. First and foremost, I used to work at a Series A tech a startup. We didn't have a dedicated HR person. We only had about 30 people. And at what point would you advise for that startup to actually hire an HR person full time? And my second question is, when you're in that process of building a corporate culture or articulating that at least, how would you go about that? Is it taking like the things that you see within the company and the things that you vibe with, or is this looking at, you know, corporate cultures of Amazon and then trying to emulate that? I just want to understand a little bit more how you go about that.
So I would say for that one, I ended up doing some work with one of the venture capital companies that had invested in our last company, and I had done a session for them on this. You know, I think the point to try to bring in some help is around 30 to 50 employees. You know, my bias is that the leaders, okay, the CEO in particular, he or she really has to set the tone. And he or she also needs to bring in their other leaders and to make sure that they're aligned. And I think they should be the ones to set the tone and develop the culture. I think if you try to be something that, you know, you can look to other companies for, you know, ones that you think are well run or ones that you admire, you know, because of what they've been able to achieve. But I think it has to align with what your own vision is and your own values. Because you have to be true to you. And, you know, as a leader in the organization and a CEO, founder, um, you know, people will judge you not only for, you know, what you're able to bring in terms of your technical expertise and the product that you've developed and all of that, but they'll judge you for who you are and how you treat people. I mean, the company that Joe and I are both on the board, the CEO has founded that company. It'll be 40 years next year, right? And it's amazing that he's still running this company, but he created a culture there of you know, really one of you know, growth and making sure that people understood the value that they bring. And it really treated people with kindness always and a real spirit of this company gives back so much to the community. I live in the town where this company is headquartered. Never knew until I was on the board of directors how much it did to help the local communities. I live close to the city of Lowell, and Lowell is more of a disadvantaged community. Our company that we're on the board has done so much. We're just so proud of them. And, you know, now it's become more in vogue for companies to, you know, talk about their social responsibility, their environmental and social responsibility. And this company just did the right thing all along. And so now that as a public company, we're codifying these and we publish it and investors want to see this, it's really not been a whole big exercise to put it together because this company always did the right thing. And it was when he and his brother started this company that many years ago, they thought about what they wanted to do. And interestingly enough, which is not what you, part of what the founder talked about was his goal was to provide employment for people and to help them grow their livelihood and then also to share in the success of the company. That was one of the core values of that organization. So I
And-
think it has to start from the top.
And Vivian, on that one, the phrase that's been used probably the last 10 years by the founder is lean but not mean,
Lean but not
which
mean. Yeah.
conveys the point that we're going to run efficiently. Your job is important, and we don't treat anybody in a mean fashion. So it really was, it sort of captured a lot. It took a while to get there, but
Yeah.
I have a few range of questions from the Zoom, if that's okay. The first is, can you offer some examples of strategically hiring to build a team with a particular outcome or company mission in mind? Or is it hiring for growth typically a more organic, iterative process? That's the first question. And then the other one is similar but related. Do you have any ideas on finding the balance between kindness and authority when managing people?
Wow, those are really good questions.
Yeah.
And we could probably talk all night about this.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
want to take it, Kim?
If I could just, when we talk about, strategic hiring, I'll give you an example of, Thermo Fisher, as they've grown over the years and some of the acquisitions that they've done, their product portfolio has expanded in the regulatory environment. So we've gone from analytical instruments, which is not highly regulated, to pharma services, where you have patients actually ingesting a product. So it becomes much more of a regulatory risk. And so having the foresight as we were starting to grow and get into that environment, COVID had just hit. And you started to see, we're in the midst of this ongoing pandemic. We're now becoming part of this much more regulatory environment. And also, what did that mean for our product portfolio, and how do we get there quicker than some of our competitors? One of those requirements was, how do we get regulatory employees or leaders that had relationships with the FDA, the WHO, things of that nature? So, but we couldn't see the pandemic coming. Nobody predicted that, right? But we could start to see, as we thought through acquisition, we thought through growing the company, that was a capability that we didn't have. And that we knew that inevitably, irregardless of the pandemic coming, we knew that those regulatory relationships and that strategic acumen was a muscle that we didn't have. And so, it's just having the foresight. That's probably a very big example of something that you could kind of see coming through an acquisition. But as you continue to grow and getting into your market segmentations, or really trying to understand what your customer needs are, how you potentially are going to pivot, how you're going to grow, it's looking at your team and being able to really understand what is going to prohibit your growth with what you don't, what talent you may not have, and being, having a little bit of the foresight to be able to try to get ahead of that.
And I think that, even in a smaller organization, I think you need to do both. I think mostly what people will do is will hire, where they see the growth is, and they aren't as thoughtful about the strategic hires early on. Unless there's a sort of a pivot in the business. I think when maybe things aren't going well, I think that's when people tend to think more of the strategic hires. But I do think early days in terms of what I've seen, it's tend to be more around growth, and typically, where the hiring ends up going early on is either, in the development cycle, hiring more engineers or whatever to get the product out, or enhancements or what have you, or on the sales side, to get more feet on the street and what have you. The question about authority and kindness. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that I think sometimes it's like parenting. I think that the best parents, and I would tell you, wasn't always the best parent, are the ones that are high standards and hold, their children accountable and responsible, but are also very loving, right, and caring. So I think from a management standpoint, to have high standards and high expectations, standards of excellence, I think you should have, and you should not compromise that if you can, but at least to set the tone for excellence. But I think that, meeting people where they are and treating them with respect and kindness, you can always do that, even if you're pushing them. The last boss I worked for was the hardest boss I ever had in terms of pushing me. And it was my last job before I stopped working full time. I never worked harder than I worked for him. But he never pushed us harder than he pushed himself. And he was probably the kindest person, is still a friend of mine, because he genuinely cared about me and my family and my needs. And when I needed a break, he was the first person to see that, hey, take some time, or focus on your family. That's what's most important to you. Um, and sometimes, even crossed the line to be, my brother was very ill, and let me cry, and about my brother's situation, and support me in a way that I, never forgot. And, but always, still there to deliver results. And the core of the relationship was in making sure that, I met his expectations and delivered on a quality, um, work that I did for the organization.
If there's no more, I've got lots of questions on the Zoom, and then I've also got a personal one.
Okay.
My personal one is just recently somebody told me, and you may say this, they told me, if you aren't reorganizing every 6 months, you're not extracting maximum value. And so my question is, in a growing organization, how often should you be looking to reorganize? What are the big indicators that you should look for? And when is it the wrong time to do it?
So I would say I wouldn't reorganize for the sake of reorganizing or just stay to a timetable. I think you look at performance, you look at what's working, you look at where you're not gaining the advantages that you want to gain. And that's at a point where you start to say, should we reorganize? Is that the answer to the performance issue? But I don't think there's one answer or one timeline that makes sense for every company.
I think that with the whole reorganization or people management, I kind of look at it like weeding a garden. It's never really done. It's something that you should always be looking at. The advantage of going through a more formal process every 6 months, I think it really depends what how far what kind of growth trajectory you have, how many people you're adding. I mean, if you're adding a lot of people and you're growing really fast, that probably makes sense, because, you can move people around. What you need in one organization might change. May want to reallocate resources, all of that. But I think it's really dependent. And so I would say part of leadership's responsibility is to kind of have that ongoing look about, okay, what do we need to do in order to maximize the performance of the organization? So there's not one right time.
If I can just answer that in a different way, and I'll give you a larger company perspective. I think you've always got to ask your question when you're reorganizing, what problem are you trying to solve? So what's broken and what are you fixing? Why are you fixing it? And what value are you going to bring to your shareholders and your customers by doing so? So if you can answer those in good faith, and get to a better outcome than you're in, yeah, those are the questions that we ask ourselves. I would say when you're in a larger company, the more you do that, the more disruptive it's going to be. So if you're going to make that shift, you better have a really good reason why. I'm going through it right now, where we're taking 8,000 people out of and shifting it into something that's very different. And while for 7,995 people, we are not changing anything about their jobs, it's completely disruptive to them. So we've definitely felt it from a revenue standpoint, and, felt a bit of a hiccup because we've simply announced that we're making a change, and it is disruptive to people. So I think you just need to, you're answering the question first for your customer and your shareholders, if you do have shareholders, but your customers. And then the second question is, how disruptive is it going to be to your employee population? What does that mean to your performance and your quality? And then how do you mitigate that risk?
Thank you.
I actually have a question. A typical thing I've seen with technology companies is you'll start off and you'll have the founders, and then your next level of hires, which are maybe friends or somebody or whatever, and you get a situation where you know that eventually you're going to have to bring in sort of adult supervision.
Mhm.
And I've seen situations where, the first engineers come in, somebody wants to be the VP of engineering. And then when you realize, okay, we've got the code working, but it isn't really industrial strength, we're really going to need an experienced VP of engineering. And then you have a lot of turmoil. Do you have any advice on how to set expectations or navigate that? And it also happens with a founder who's a technical founder who has to sometimes be shifted to a CTO role and put off somewhere on the side.
Right. Well, I think those situations are never easy, and I have seen them. You know, I think it goes back to something we all said early on here, is that, you know, having those honest dialogues all along the way are really important. And, you know, with the engineer that maybe isn't the one that can take it to the next level, if uh, the CEO, yeah, or, you know, or the board or whatever is starting to at least say that there's, you know, that maybe that might be coming, that they have some sort of dialogue, that it's not, you know, I don't think people like to be blindsided in those situations. In the best situations, they become a part of the problem they're trying, you know, you're trying to solve. And I think you know, people can come to that. I mean, it's hard, very hard, particularly, I think, not only for the engineering, but particularly when a founder, when that happens. But hopefully he or she recognizes that, you know, the ultimate value of what they're trying to build and their idea or what have you, will be able to scale and get to that next level by bringing in the expertise of someone who's seen it and done it.
So I have another question from people on the Zoom. You've all mentioned being part of rapid expansions and possible contractions in a company. Do you have any lessons learned from an organization that on contracting? How do you go through laying off a workforce gracefully? How do you maintain morale during challenging times?
Oh,
I've
oh,
had fun.
that's for sure.
I'm living it. Here's my advice. As leaders, just know that when you're contracting and you're letting people go, everybody is watching you. So it's the people that you're letting go, but more importantly, it's the people that are staying. So it's how you go about it and how you treat people is going to be important to those ones that are staying. We just went through a significant workforce reduction. We had 1,100 people that unfortunately had lost their jobs during 2023. So our biggest area of opportunity, or my biggest area of focus, is how do I create stabilization amongst the workforce? And I would love to, you know, I think it's really trying to understand, one, it's good planning to make sure that if you're going to cut, you do it well and you try to do it once. And so that you can confidently, and that's not always going to, you can never guarantee, but that you're able to get your workforce to a place where you can say, okay, we've done this. There's a financial rationale, you know, the math just doesn't work. And, you know, here we are, and, you know, we move forward. But I think it's staying really close to what is important to your employee population at that standpoint, because at that standpoint, there's fear. And so being able to provide an environment, and that's constant communication about where you are and where you're going, and listening to your employee population around how are they feeling, what's important to them, what do they value, and being able to kind of translate that into your day-to-day activities is going to be really, really important to win them back, you know, to win the hearts and the minds of the employee population, so that they start to get to a place where they're comfortable and they trust you again, and you can start to get work done.
And to add to that, I would say, if you have good talent management practices, you have good, if you're a performance-based company, an achievement-oriented company, and you do performance evaluations, you do 9-box calibrations, you know who your talent is, making sure that anyone who is impacted, that you're focusing on the people that are not adding the most. And so focusing on that, and maybe having some retention program in place for those who are critical to keep, maybe another thing to think about as part of the equation.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, one of the worst examples that I'm sure everyone heard about was what Twitter did. I mean, it was just, people were horrified with how people were informed, how people were treated and all of that. I've never, you know, some companies, you know, turn off people's access right away. There are protocols and safety things that you need to go through. I would tell you, in my experience, very rarely has there been anybody that has done damage to a company. I think a company has to be prudent, protect its assets. But, I think putting a box on someone's desk and telling them they have to be done, in an hour or two, I just think there's ways that you can do that. And honestly, I've never, I've been more liberal in terms of, of, of not giving people a couple days notice to clean their desks, to go, or, to trying to accommodate them. When you do things really at scale, it's hard to do that. I can remember being in front of a group of, I don't know, 50, 100 people, and I couldn't give them the courtesy of meeting with them one-to-one because it was just me that had to process out that many people. I felt terrible. Felt every individual needed at least, the courtesy of, okay, this is how your benefits will work, and this is what you need to do, and, some sort of, if you need help or assistance. I mean, fortunately, I've been in companies where we had really good employee assistance programs. So it wasn't like 1-800 call nobody. We had people that often were on site to provide, support to people. And then you also have to take care of the people that remain, and people are watching. I think whoever made that comment, I think that's really true. So never easy. But again, try to understand, again, trying to treat people like you'd want to be treated in that situation. More often than not, the golden rule works all the time.
Perfect. If there's, I've got more, the Zoom is very active, so we've got lots of questions from you on the Zoom side. I've got two cultural questions now for you guys. One, how should founders/managers go about establishing and spreading new culture in organizations so it feels genuine? And how can they preserve the culture as the organization scales? That's the sort of first question. And then the second question is it worth having a strong or a positive culture where obviously the two things are not exclusive, but they can be linked together. But some organizations have very strong cultures and some have positive wishy-washy cultures. What do you think are some of the ways that you should try and target the balance between those two things? Do you want me to repeat the first question?
I think I remember the first question. It's about, how does a leader introduce new elements of culture and kind of, top down? I think that for one, culture is really about the way the work gets done in a company and what the experience is, the employee experience. So it's not something that can be dictated from the top down. I think where we have had a very collaborative culture. People are very invested in the success of one another. They generally enjoy each other, and that's been great. We don't want to lose that. But we did want to focus more on the elements of a performance-based culture. And so we introduced it, through our senior leadership team, that this is where the direction that we want to go. But it's not something you could say, okay, as of tomorrow, this is our new culture. We're going to have this many elements of a collaboration culture and this many elements of a performance-based culture. It's something that you have to feed, you have to talk about in every communication, you have to reference, you have to reward elements of a culture, and it has to be authentic. It has to be, the senior leadership team has to live the culture that they'd like to see. And then it really does become the way that work gets done and the way that the employees experience working at a company.
Yeah, I think people see, who's rewarded, who you promote, who succeeds in the organization, how. I think rituals in organizations are important. And, having ways that, and it doesn't have to be through, spending a lot of money all the time, but, ways that people can come together. Company we worked at was one, did hackathons. A lot of companies do that, but we did it early on, and it was an elaborate thing, and people enjoyed it, and everybody was a part of it. Sometimes it was, in early companies, it was, people breaking bread together, people bringing food in so that you got to know one another over lunch or what have you. Ways that people could get to know one another as people, I think also contribute to the environment. But I do think that, back to where we started with the values, what are the things you want to reinforce? And then, in terms of how you build a culture around that, it's the actions around that support that. and being conscious about it.
If I could just, one other thing that I would say, and from a very tactical standpoint, when you think about culture and values, so the company that I was with for a couple of years before I went back to Thermo Fisher, a very small life science company that had, numerous amounts of very small acquisitions that had happened. We had a genomics company, a biorepository. And so as we came together as a publicly traded company, they had never been brought together. And, one of their first questions for me as the head of HR was, well, what are our values as an organization? And quite frankly, I very purposefully brought in I did have a consultant who was he was a character. He's the head of culture at Facebook at one time. So he worked for Zuckerberg directly, and he had lots of stories for us. But we went through an exercise where I specifically, each company that had been acquired, they were small, they were innovative, and they were incredibly proud of the products that they brought to the table, but they each had very different cultures. So instead of having the CEO come in and say, this is what our values are going to be, and this is how it's going to determine our culture, we had culture champions. And they came from the different parts of the business, so that really the intent that was very purposeful around how do we create values, and we take the best out of all of these, very small companies that were coming together. So my advice in all of that is where you have people, where you have your culture champions, people that have the enthusiasm or the EIEIO that Viv talked about, bring them together to help you form, what values, who do we want to be? Even, whether you're at, $1 million or $100 million, what are the values that are going to stay with you, and let your people be a part of that process.
Hi, thank you. I actually want to have a question that's going to combine both sessions. You're a startup and founder, CEO, and you're trying to attract some really great talent, and you don't have the resources to bring them on at the value that they're at. Any tips that you can provide to help us bring these individuals on board? Negotiation tips, equity tips, or whatever.
Equity.
Equity. Yeah.
Do you want to?
Well, I think that the enthusiasm of the leaders bringing on talent, when I took my first job where I had the top job in human resources, I took a pay cut. I ended up working for like 2 layers down in the organization than I wanted to, but they sold me on the company. In part, this woman was so smart who recruited me. She goes, I know you don't want to work here, but can you just help me with this problem? She kind of hooked me in. And I got to see how she operated and how the leadership operated and whatever. And I saw honestly how needy they were in terms of, I really thought I could help them. And I got to, they were good people. They were people that I thought I could build something with. And it turned out. And so, we went in, they didn't pay me what I wanted. I took equity instead. Every time I had a choice, I opted for that. I was in a situation, fortunately, that I could do that. My husband and I, worked that out, and they sold me on who they were and their vision for the organization, but also how they treated me in the recruitment process. And, and the equity was generous, though the cash was not. The company changed my life. I mean, I personally, professionally, financially, it was the best thing that I ever did, but if anybody ever told me I was going to go work there, I thought they were pesty, kind of in terms of how they hounded me. But again, they hooked me in and helped me. I could see that I could help them because they sought my knowledge, my expertise. So that worked for me. Maybe that would work with others. And, I think that if you're making that connection through the recruitment process, take time to get to know the people. Part of it is getting to, go out to dinner with them, spend time with them, engage them in your thinking. And I think that will be successful for you.
I would agree. The one thing I'll say from the last company, smaller, we just had, gone public. And so we were recruiting a lot of executives and it was, well, what's so special about this company, especially in a market, 2 to 3 years ago, where it was incredibly competitive. The compensation was just ridiculous. And so dealing with some of, trying to compete with some of your larger competitors was really difficult. We had to have a really good story and you put on your sales hat and it's, here's what's different. Here's how we differentiate ourselves from anybody else. Here's what we see, the product portfolio and how it's going to grow. Here's the opportunity that we have together as a team. And really being able to lay that out. I think Viv's right in terms of you're making a bit more investment than you would at any other X, Y, and Z company in terms of trying to build that relationship. So it was, with some of the executives, especially that we're bringing in, it was, let's go have dinner. Let's meet for a drink. What questions can we answer for you? So the courting process was probably a little bit different than anywhere else. Then the other piece of advice that I'll give you, because I've made the mistake, is be really careful when you receive that appreciation, right? So when you've got them, be really careful about the type of person that you're bringing in. If it's just enthusiasm, you're really looking for a background where we had people that were really like, yeah, bring me in, sign me up, I'm ready, and then they did nothing. And, it's a costly mistake. So be careful of enthusiasm versus, really having a level of engagement. Some of the ones that I found were the best were people that had an entrepreneurial spirit, that had done it, kind of been there, done it, and they loved the chase. It was, I did it, I was successful, I want to do it again. And I think what you find with that is you also find a bit of the money comes secondary. It's the chase and the win that they're looking for. So for what it's worth.
Yeah. This woman had a question here. I want to make sure she, yeah.
So, I mean, I think you guys raised really, really good points. The one question I had is post-COVID in this remote learning, not remote learning, but rather remote first kind of work environment. What's the most important for budding startups, especially when those human connections are so important? And what do you guys recommend even now as like the leaders of big companies?
Both of you guys, because I got out of the workforce full time before COVID and more remote work became more prevalent. So these folks really have better experience, so they can speak to it.
It's interesting because in 2021, there was the Great Resignation, and it was all about, the focus was all about improving employee engagement. We introduced a remote first, workforce policy where you could choose to come into the office or you could choose to work remotely. But we encourage people to come into the office because we struggle with that connection to mission and vision, and you miss out on that. If you're on Zoom all day and the only people you're talking to are the ones that are scheduled in your calendar, you're not running into anyone, you don't have any spontaneous conversations, it becomes challenging. You do sort of lose connection. So we are introducing kind of a gradual, gentle, come back on a rotating schedule. So we're having groups come back. Also, we let go of some of our real estate, so we don't have as much as we had previously. So we don't have room for everyone to come back at our headquarters, but we're rotating teams that really need to work together and need to collaborate, and doing a 3-day a week, come in 3 days every other week. And then the other days work remotely. We think it's the best of both worlds. It's not it's not mandating that everyone come back 5 days, but we are hoping to get the advantage of those collaboration weeks.
In situations that I've seen where they've stayed fully remote, the leadership has done a good job of traveling out to meet employees, particularly if there was critical mass in some place prior to, the pandemic, and creating more social or educational opportunities for people to come together, so that you have that connection. Though, there is something to be said, depending on how teams collaborate and how they work, the togetherness, sometimes can yield better productivity. And I think one size doesn't fit all, right? I think, the good news, one of the companies I consulted with, the leadership team was so skilled, but they were all over the place. But this company was early stage. They would have never been able to attract that talent pool if they were just in the Boston area, for example. So there's the yin and the yang of it, right? And you have to make your trade-offs given what your organization needs and what's important. And it may change over time.
I would echo the sentiment, having gone through the pandemic, it's something that I never thought as an HR practitioner that I'd have to even think about bringing people back to work. But I would say, I'd echo both of what they said. Whatever you're going to do, just be consistent about it. Human beings just want a level of consistency. Say what more importantly, and everybody's going to laugh, bring food and people will come. It's key.
I've got there's a few remote questions that you've already answered, but just a remote question that was in the Zoom that I saw earlier. Did you experience any loss of productivity from remote working? Did you guys notice anything?
Yes, because we have huge manufacturing sites and labs where we need people. So yeah, there was definitely the most obvious level of a loss of productivity from that standpoint. I think the one that wasn't as obvious is to Allison's point, where you had people that, made connections, and where you have, we have multiple business offerings. So where you have people not making those connections and coming into the office, we definitely saw a loss of productivity there. But
Yeah, I think people figured out how to be productive working remotely. Initially, there was a dip, but once people figured it out, they're very productive. I think it's more a case of connection and, having that sense of pride in your company and feeling that sense of camaraderie with your peers and those moments of celebration. It's hard to do it when you're remote. You can put on lots of events that are virtual events. It's not the same.
Yeah. I do think that any kind of, if to work a fully remote environment, I do think that you have to do a really good job at managing expectations and performance. And I think that if you're managing expectations and performance, you can have a fully remote workforce, but then you have to have ways of bringing people together, or visiting them or whatever the case may be. But I think for one company I worked with who's bought by IBM, and IBM was fully remote at that point. They said IBM used to say, "I've been moved," and then it was, "I'm by myself," is what it was. But they ended up having this big push back to the workforce because they had seen a loss of productivity. But I think that they weren't managing its performance. I stayed for a year in transition after the company was bought, but I think that caused them down the road to have much bigger workforce reductions because they just didn't manage that changing large workforce that they had in the way that they should have. So.
Good. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank Vivian, Allison, and Kim for a great panel.
Thank you.
The nuggets that you put out there for entrepreneurs from when you're starting to when, right now, they're probably not thinking about how I'm going to grow, but, having a little insight of what I'm going to have to think about, and then what am I going to, I didn't think about that. I think that's going to be telling for people as they look back over the years. I do think there was one point made that I totally didn't expect, and that was EIEIO. And I think that is impactful and that I'll remember it specifically. The other advice is great, and it will be in my memory as I move forward. But EIEIO, I don't think I'll get that out of my head. So can we have a round of applause for our panel?